And now on to our main topic here on Mastering Dungeons. We are going to check out yet another role-playing game that is not D&D. We are doing this because as much as we love D&D as a brand and as a lifestyle and as a game, we love 5e, but we want to understand where D&D and 5e sits in the realm of all role-playing games. So we will continue our look at these other games. And we're doing so with the understanding that D&D is a very different game than some, but taking the cool mechanics, trying to plug them into D&D may not work, but at least getting an idea of what sorts of mechanics are out there may help you understand and appreciate the mechanics of D&D even more. And what are we looking at this week, Teos?
Ooh, we are looking at 13th Age. This is a fantastic game. I'm a huge fan of 13th Age. I'm a huge fan of Rob Heinsoo. I first met him during the 4th edition days, and then I had the pleasure of having him as DM for a 13th Age game. He is one of the finest DMs you can find out there, and he is probably like when I think of Devils, I think of him running a game because he will offer you these bargains and his eyes basically glow with fire when he's like, I tell you what you could do. And he just like he gets this like super happiness and you're like, "Oh god, what is this offer?" And it's always this, if you did the following. Oh man, and he has a happiness when he does that that's infectious. And that kind of approach is some
Mhm.
of the special sauce that gets woven into this game, and it was fun to read, like, rereading the book and looking at the beginning of it. And I should say, one of the covers looks like this. Looking at this book,
Mhm.
the beginning of it talks about a couple, and a lot of the marketing initially did sort of two things. Like, this is an homage to third and fourth edition. We can talk about why. And then the idea of bringing in story centric games. They mentioned things like
Mhm.
Vampire, but just the idea of these games that are outside of D&D that have a much stronger what would your character do? What dramatic tension can we create in this game? How do we resolve that? How does the DM, shape
Mhm.
their story around the characters in a way that didn't exist at during 4E, right? For D&D.
Yep, and when you play it or when you read it, you can definitely see the homages to the D&D and the influence of those. One of the reasons we talked about Fate so early was
Yeah.
because a lot of the things that we see in games that try to bring in the role-playing, narrative-driven aspect of these games is available to you in Fate and have been borrowed. So as we talk about this, you'll see uh, all of these games being brought in.
Mhm.
So let's talk about first 2E versus 1E because there is a second edition being created right now. And the playtest is out, right? You
Yeah.
can
Well,
playtest 2E right now.
you can sign up for it and they'll send it to you via email. So you can go to the Pelgrane Press website, or if you go to Rob Heinsoo's blog, you can get it from there. There are links in our show notes to where you can do it. You basically send an email saying, I would like to playtest it in my group, and then they send it out to you so that you can run playtests off
Mhm.
of the playtest versions.
Yep. So who were the designers on this? The main designers were Rob Heinsoo, as Teos said, and Jonathan Tweet. Both of these gentlemen were designers, lead designers for 3E and 4E, and they also worked on games like Feng Shui. Rob did. Rob designed the Three Dragon Ante and Epic Spell Wars card games, many other board games, card games, and miniature games. Jonathan Tweet worked on Ars Magica, Over the Edge, the revised Talislanta game, several miniature and card games. Many of his role-playing games were light on the rules and heavy on storytelling. So the two of them working together are an interesting pair,
Hmm.
and they're good friends. And in the book itself, they have sidebars where the two of them will give their feedback or their thoughts on a certain rule a certain way to play, and sometimes they're different. Sometimes they
Yeah.
even disagree with each other almost, which is fascinating for game masters to see that even the designers of the game may run a game differently than the game itself might play.
Yeah, I really love that. Throughout this book, just these comments are great, and they can be like, I have this tip and you have this tip, Rob has a tip, Jonathan has a tip, but it can also be that real like, in my game I don't tend to love this kind of thing, so here's the way I run with this, right? And we'll talk about the icons. They've
Mhm.
got a neat example around icons that maybe we can go back and talk about how they present that there.
Yep. Well, so talking about icons, the first thing the book covers in detail isn't the rules, isn't creating your character. It's talking about icons. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book here. Most D20 games have powerful NPCs who shape the world behind the scenes. 13th Age brings them forward, making these 13 powerful NPCs into icons that the PCs will aid or oppose over the course of each campaign. So right off the bat, this being in the front of the book tells you that this game wants you as the DM and the player to focus more on the story and these larger than life aspects of the world, which
Hmm.
you can tailor as the game master. And notice I said aspects.
Aspects, I
Teos
saw
nodded
that, I
because
heard
that is
that.
a fate that is a fate term that
Mhm.
becomes important for gameplay and world building. So,
And I think
what
this
do you have to
also,
say about these icons?
yeah, it also reflects sort of the vampire clans, and there were some parts where I think, I forget if it's Jonathan or Rob, but they specifically sort of say like clans in certain games, right? And they're talking about
Mhm,
whether you're part of this family or that family of vampires, and in vampire. But the icons are great. So you have things like the Dwarf King, the Emperor of like the human lands, the Orc Lord, the Lich King, the Prince of Shadows, the High Druid, the Great Gold Worm, and each one gets a page. They have a symbol, so an actual icon for the icon. They have a quote. So,
mhm,
like the High Druid says, "There's a place for your roads and your cities, hunched tight to the shores of that fangless thing you still call a sea." Right? Just and so just steeps
mhm,
you in that where they can be found in the world, and there is a map and a setting that comes here that you can use. And so they tell you what places are they found in, common knowledge that's out there, how adventurers relate to them, their allies and enemies, their history, and then one of my favorite things is this thing called the true danger, which basically is the world would unravel if the following happened around this icon, right? So, like, if this one icon didn't
mhm,
have a thing to fight, that would unravel things, right? Um, and so,
mhm.
if everything will be all right unless the Emperor and the High Druid truly go to war, right? So it tells you about those important tensions that exist in the game and gives you a feel for that drama. And the whole idea of this is
Mhm.
your players have an immediate stake in the game, the way we talked about with Fate, right? Well, when you're designing the aspects for the campaign, well, here you're not designing these, but you are choosing which ones to put front and center through your alignment with them, right?
Mhm.
You can say that your big concern is the Lich King, and that you once made a deal with entities of the allies of the Prince of Shadows, right? And that lends color to the game and drives the way things can develop.
And in a lot of these games that we have been or will be talking about, there's a concept called fronts.
Mm.
Fronts are the larger parts, the larger threats in the world, and the front is what it is and what it's trying to do. But what comes from that is what you can present and put in front of the players. And these fronts can change based on how the characters are dealing with the things that are in front of them. And so these icons are fronts
Hmm.
because Teo said, what would the worst possible scenario be if something happened to the Dwarf King or the Elf Queen? And those are like the final steps of these fronts.
Yeah. And one of the ideas of it being called 13th age is that there have been previous ages. And at some point, the 14th could come into play. And
Mhm,
so you can decide, which of those things could propel towards that if you so want to do.
Yep. So in a good storytelling game, you have these large concepts, but then you also have to relate them to the characters, or the characters won't care as much. And so what 13th Age does is it gives you relationships to the icons. So at first level, you get 3 relationship points, and you can put those points into relationships with the icon. These can be positive, negative, or conflicted relationships.
Hmm.
And you get dice for each of them. At the beginning of a session or an adventure, you can roll those dice. And if a 5 and a 6 come up, that means that the story that you're about to play is going to be affected by that relationship in some way. So there's this storytelling impetus based on the die roll that you have set in motion because of your relationship.
Yeah. And like I played a game with Rob, and the first thing Rob did is he had us all roll these dice to see what relationships activated. And one of my friends was playing a diabolist related character and a sort of tiefling type concept, and he rolled 3 6s. so so Rob's eyes glow, and Rob, of course, is just completely improvising this session, right? And he just immediately goes, "Oh,
Right.
well, everybody, forget about it. This is an adventure about the Diabolists. On we go." And begins to weave the tale accordingly, right? I mean, and of course, not everybody is that kind of a DM. I am not. That is a level of improvisation that scares me a bit. Though I aspire to get better at that. But I do take these things with a little bit of pre planning and love nudging the story in these directions. And I'm significantly nudges, right? And this is right from the beginning, you're doing that, right? Which is really cool.
So we have the larger scale story, the characters defined by their relationships to them. And
Mhm.
now we get into the character building. So we
And can
have
I
your
add
typical
there?
race, you have your typical class. Oh, you sure
I
can.
just Yeah, I just want to say that conflicted is interesting because it sort of suggests that something happened with this entity that they may support or destroy you depending on the situation. So it's very like movie novelish, right? Where you have
Mhm.
this person that you walk in to make a deal. Yeah, I know the so and the dwarves, but the dwarves may tear you limb from limb, or they may grant you what you want. It either way can go because of your interesting relationship in the past, and that one's a lot of fun too. Instead of just saying that there's some like
For
neutral,
sure.
right? It's not neutral; it's conflicted. And I think that's so
Mhm.
cool.
Yep. So then we get into what I call 4E territory. So we get the races and the classes, and it's very similar to 4E, 3E. It's very recognizable. Your typical attributes, how you get those attributes. Um, for 4E, there were healing surges, and they have recoveries in 13th Age, which are very similar. Uh, you so you get through that part, which is very D&D, and then you get to the one unique thing. You create one unique thing about your character. Each character should have one unique feature you invent for him or her when you create the character. Your one unique thing is an unusual trait that sets your character apart from every other hero. The moment when all the players sit down together with the GM to create their character's one unique thing is often the moment when a campaign comes to life. If you listen to our Fate episode, this is your high concept.
Yeah.
This is what you are all about.
And they can be really wild, right? And they can be more wild than they are in Fate. Though, depends
Mhm.
on the setting for Fate. But some of the examples in the book, right? I am a deathless pirate whose soul is trapped in a gem controlled by the blue dragon. Or I am the reincarnation of
Mhm.
an ancient icon, I don't know which yet. Or I was the rudest lady in waiting of the imperial court. And so there's some things here that are like, when you first see them, you're like, whoa, this is wild. What are the constraints of this? And fortunately, there is a lot of advice in the book, in this section and even elsewhere on it, including this kind of designer talk. And one of my favorite parts is where Jonathan says, I don't tend to love really wild things like I am a living zombie. I tend to love things that are more like I'm the best at swordplay in the land, right? Whereas Rob likes pretty wild things, and he talks about what he does with those. And then they give you these concepts of like, let's say that your character does say, I'm the best at swordplay in the land. Cool. That doesn't mean you win at everything, because that kind of to make this dramatic and interesting, let's talk about what might prevent you from realizing your full capabilities now, right? What is it that is dampening your skills now? Maybe you have grief over something you lost, and working on that together, you start getting into these campaign seeds, and it feels more like those fate aspects, right? Maybe you're living undead, but your appearance is cloaked by illusion so that it's not too wild and destructive to play in a city campaign, right? So that's the kind of thing that you can
Right.
do to weave these concepts so that they're really rich and interesting, but they're balanced, they're not breaking things.
Right. And where this comes to bear for me is the difference between a very highly transactional,
Mhm.
right, you roll every to hit, and trying to insert these more narrative things is a great idea. It's a great concept. But how does it actually play at the table when you're rolling dice and making decisions? Is there a mechanic that refers back to it? Is there
Mhm.
a mechanic that actually ties to it, or is it separated? And the more technically, the more mathematical, mechanical the game is, the less likely it is to do that well, or the less likely it is to do that closely. And what 13th Age does is it removes skills from the game and adds instead these backgrounds. So what you get is you get a certain number of skill points, usually 8, that you can assign to these different backgrounds. And you can go up to a +5 with each background you choose. And these are sort of smaller aspects from
Mhm.
Fate with a description of who you are, what you can do. So instead of saying, "Oh, well, I am trained in lock picking, so I look at my dexterity and I look at my whatever proficiency bonus or whatever you do in the game that you're playing." This is I use that bonus if I am a master lock picker
Mhm.
or a trained cat burglar
Right.
or whatever
Or a
you choose
locksmith if you
there.
were
So
legit, right?
you can or a locksmith or whatever. And these can be vague or very specific. They can be used in different ways as well. So if you can come up with something that might have a broad use, you can probably get more out of it than very specific, but they go through in the book and give you sort of advice on creating them and using them that is fairly solid.
Yeah. And it's nice because these backgrounds mean that they give you suggested ones, so you can certainly choose from them, but you can just make your own. And so you can, through the combination of one unique thing and a few backgrounds that you're choosing to have, you really very quickly have a super rich concept in your mind, and you should be doing this at the table with everybody else. So everybody ends up with really rich concepts. And like I still remember one unique things from convention games, right? I remember what
Mhm,
almost, if not most, if not all of the table, most of the table had at these games, because they can be so rich and wild, right? So like one of my favorites was someone who said that they'd been in love with a dryad, but they decided that they could not just live by the side of this tree forever. So they said they had to leave, and the dryad cursed this person so that whenever they stopped, the roots would begin to grow from their feet. All right, that was their one unique thing.
mhm,
So, and then in the fight we were doing, he ended up knocked prone, and so the DM decided that all these roots started growing out around him, and we had to hack him out, right? And those are those kinds of balances where it becomes much more narrative, and it's DM judgment, and it's and that kind of thing. And you a little bit like Mike Olson said in our interview, right? You have to want to do these kinds of games, right? You have to want this a little more, less of the you want to work together and think through these things and enjoy that drama of it versus wait, you prevented me from doing what I wanted on my turn, or that kind
Yeah.
of.
So all that storytelling, narrative-driven gameplay does come in here and marries itself to a more ROLL play game that is a mix of 4th and 3rd edition.
Yeah.
Another mechanic that they've added is called the Escalation Die. So this is something that I'm going to let Teos talk about, but it's an interesting concept, and I want to hear how
Yeah.
Teos describes it before I say anything else.
Sure. So what this is at the start of, so you use normal kind of what you'd say D&D initiative, right? Like it's basically your D20 roll plus your dex type thing, and you're going round and round a turn at a time, and your order is your order. But at the start of the second round of combat, the DM puts out D6, and you want like the biggest, coolest looking die you can get, and that is the escalation die. And on round 2, it's set to 1. And this means all the PCs gain a +1 to attack rolls equal to the die. And each round thereafter, it ratchets up until you can reach that maximum of +6. And this seems really bizarre when you first start playing, but it means that your fights can start hard and then they get easier as the characters start hitting all the time. And it drives tactical choices. So it's things like, I've got this really big power I want to use because it's sort of 4E style powers. Do I want to use my really cool ability, or do I want to save that for later on when I get a plus to its attack, right? Monsters usually don't get this bonus. Sometimes they do. But a number of things can trigger off of it in the game. So there can be some things that if the escalation die is a 3 or higher, then this power gains an extra benefit, or this monster might behave a certain way. So things can play off of it in a very interesting way. And what I see it doing is it keeps combat shorter. It keeps combat fluid from one encounter to the next. It lets you as DM hit really hard initially, but characters are sort of going to overcome and gain victory if it's that kind of balanced encounter. Yeah, so I like it a fair bit, and I've seen DMs use it in D&D games as a mechanic they port into their D&D game. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I think you pretty much summed up what I was going to say. It gives a mechanic that makes combat different from encounter to encounter rather than having the same old thing happen. One example right from the Barbarian, the first class they write about, is if you get a certain number of rages, right? But if you wait until the escalation die reaches a certain number, you get to rage and it doesn't cost you a rage.
Mm-hmm.
So that would reward you for waiting a bit rather than the first thing that every barbarian does is, okay, I use a bonus action and I rage.
And
Boom.
I love that.
Happens every table.
Like, as a barbarian, sometimes I've found that I wait a couple of rounds and I'm like, oh, this is sort of hard. I should have raged. But if I rage now, I'm only getting like 2 rounds of benefit for it. So I guess I'll wait. But if I were really playing my character, I would rage right now because this requires, and that's when you get this benefit makes up for that, right? Like, oh, it's okay if you decide to do it late.
Yep. And like some things might be you can only use this sort of thing on an even die number or an odd die number. So it keeps players from being able to just do the same thing over and over again, which
Yeah.
helps eliminate the problem if your players are min-maxers and that takes away from someone's fun at the table, or makes you think outside the just what's the best thing I can do right now. It breaks that up. It breaks up
You're
that
right.
monotony of, oh, here we go again. It's going to be the same thing over and over. So if you like a tactical game, but you also like a little bit of randomness or a little bit of diversity in the action economy that you see, then this die is a great way to break that up.
And it's you kind of mentioned the odd even thing, and it's worth noting that a number like in general, the classes feel very 4E-ish with a touch of 3 probably here and there and some other additions, but it they you have
Mhm,
powers that work like they do in 4th edition, and your spells feel like powers more than traditional spells. But they have these chaotic elements to them. So like you're casting a lightning fork, and if you make a natural even attack roll, right? So the d20 result is even, you can attack an additional target with the spell, right? And that's that, like you're saying, it breaks
mhm,
up that optimization a bit because you don't always know what will happen as a result of it. And the game feels a little less predictable. And a lot of the abilities have these sort of things that, well, on an even or on an odd, something different might happen, which is kind of cool. And
mhm.
and also
And
just
what's
that the
the deal
game
with
has this tactical, it does still have this tactical feel to it, right? Which is fascinating. It has this sort of like now they don't want to hang their hat on minis. So unlike 4E, which was very like segmented, they sort of have these more rough concepts of distance and things that are kind of nice. But
Mhm,
it does have this idea of, I want to use my big attack, and I want to tear down these minions and things like that, that give you that sort of D&D feeling around this narrative story. It's a really interesting pairing.
mhm. I made a Seinfeld reference before we started recording, but I'm about to make another one. What's the deal with monsters in 13th Age?
Yeah, I like monsters. So they're on one hand, they tend to be certainly simpler than a 4th edition monster, but they tend to have like a cool power like thing, a descriptive thing they do that's neat, that's very like feels like this monster, right? It'll show the tenacity of the orc, or it shows the way that the ooze can envelop you or tear away your armor or something like that. But then in the later books, like there are additional, there are lots of this book is worth saying is well supported, lots of supplements, lots of adventures, all kinds of content you can find on the Pelgrane Press site. And the monsters start having things like what they'll call nastier specials, and it's again speaks to the idea of, hey, you DM, play with this, right? So monsters may have variants. So they may say like, the ooze might have this thing or that thing or the other thing. So you get to choose what your monster looks like a bit, and then they'll say, and nastier specials, right? When this monster is meant to feel a little more like a significant threat, like a boss, like a named version of it or something like that, then you can add this power to it and make it nastier in this way, make these changes. And the fact that they're recommendations rather than like say 4th edition, which would have like, you know, goblin skirmisher, goblin boss, right? It's not that. They're just saying,
Mhm.
hey, play with it, make these changes to your monster when you want this kind of a feeling. And I think that's a really neat approach that speaks to the aspect of what they want their game to feel like, right?
So overall, would you say 13th Age is a good, at least beginning attempt to meld a more narrative storytelling driven game and a more mechanical dice-based role-based game into the same game while still keeping the mechanical strategy portion of the game intact?
Yeah, I would. And I think that you can that can apply in a number of ways. Meaning, like, if all you've ever played is D&D, if you want a little more narrative angle, it's a neat way to do that. Or if you like playing both games, this is a way that can be an in between that makes you happy, right? And so I've seen players in both of those situations really enjoy 13th Age.
And we will continue to look at games to see this variation on themes, a variation on styles. And you can get 13th Age right now directly from Pelgrane Press at pelgranepress.com/13th dash age. It's also on Drive Through RPG. There is an SRD for the game. And you can also sign up for that playtest that we talked about for the second edition of 13th Age. Anything else you want to mention before we close?
Yeah, it's great. Great game.
All right. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this. I've only played 13th Age twice, but I enjoyed it both times. And thank you to our patrons for keeping these lights on. Thank you to all our listeners But for our Master of Dungeon supporters, we give you a special thanks. We give a special shout out to our Master of Realms subscribers in our show notes, and to our Masters of the Multiverse. Well, this one's for you. Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Robin Dermy, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Shawn Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, The Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Krishnan, I'm not going to Simone say it again, Joe Tyler, Matias Valero at Twin Portals, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you all for your support. If you like the show, please do consider supporting our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. You can also leave feedback on Apple Podcasts or anywhere that you are listening to this podcast. Give us a review so other people know what we're doing here. Teos, you've got new stuff up on your blog, I know. Tell us about that.
Yeah, head over to alphastream.org where you can find my thoughts on compatibility and 1D&D and how good or bad it is to be compatible with the previous/current edition. How about you?
Where else can we find you?
Oh, you can find me on Mastodon.
Oh, me? Oh,
yeah.
I'm right here. I'm right here on Twitter at Sean Merwin. The podcast is on Twitter at Mastering DND. Podcast is on Mastodon at Dice Camp, and I'm at Mastodon at Tabletop Social. And you can, of course, find us on our Patreon and also on YouTube, where you can leave comments on the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. Woo. So we have made it out of the 13th age, and we are heading toward the 14th age. So what are we going to do now?
Well, we're going to reveal that I actually have a very strong relationship with the Dwarf King, and that's why I tend to go outside and hammer things all the time. Hammer time.
Yes, I have a strong relationship with the halfling thief because of my hairy toes.